So this gospel of free trade, this moral belief in free markets and the freedom of trade, was, of course, a project to be fulfilled. Okay? Smith was trying to create the theoretical basis for a program of economic reforms. And at the heart of those reforms was the repeal of the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws had been introduced in 1815 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in order to protect the price of British corn from cheaper imported corn from the continent of Europe once trade had been restored after hostilities. But it was also seen by many to be a use of the state to protect the aristocratic landed interest. The landowners who benefited most were, of course, the aristocrats who owned the land, who produced the corn. So it was seen to be a very, if you like, class-specific piece of legislation. Now, as you know, because there's the rise of commerce and manufacturing and of financial services that I talked about on Thursday, there are a whole bunch of other ways of generating wealth and prosperity that had developed fairly rapidly in the century before at the 1840s. And for them, the Corn Laws represented a sort of politically symbolic target to repeal. So you have this thing called the Anti-Corn Law League, founded in 1837 by two hugely important figures, Richard Cobden and John Bright, and they became to seen, and the Anti-Corn Law League generally came to be seen to represent something that became known as the Manchester School of Political Economy. The Manchester School, because Manchester was the heart of the textile industry, it was the heart of manufacturing, and it was seen to represent a new, if you like, bourgeois, middle-class set of interests opposed to the way in which the aristocracy continued to have dominance of economic policy, and arguing that, and this is very important, arguing that what the Corn Laws did was drive up the price of corn and therefore the price of bread for the humble working man and woman. Okay, that is to say, if you take away the Corn Laws, they argued, the staple of the working class diet would be reduced. This Manchester School becomes hugely influential throughout the 19th century, and Manchester comes to represent the classical version of liberal political economy, so much so that it built, in the 1850s, they build this monument to the achievement of free trade after the repeal of the Corn Laws, which finally happens in 1846. Free Trade Hall is constructed, and moreover, it's constructed on the very site of a massacre that had occurred in 1819 when working people had gathered in protest to demand reform and was slain, struck down by effectively by the military. Okay, so the Free Trade Hall is built on the site of this great symbol of radical protest to show the way in which the interests of the middle class and the working class had supposedly converged around the campaign for free trade. So, to reiterate the point that you can't actually think of liberal political economy as the preserve of any one party, it's the Conservative Party, led by Sir Robert Peel, that repeals the Corn Laws in 1846. Okay? It splits the Conservative Party, the Tory Party, basically in half. 112 vote for Peel, 231 vote against it, but the measure is carried with the support of the Whig and the Whig Party, which becomes the Liberal Party. Now, I want to just very quickly make clear that the Tories who vote against the repeal of the Corn Laws aren't just are not just defenders of the aristocracy and the landed interest. Okay, there are also a group of Tory radicals, okay, who see themselves as defending an organic sense of community and of defending the interests of the working people. These people campaigned for things like factory reform. You know, they were the first people to try and introduce measures that would ameliorate the conditions in factories. They opposed the reform of the Poor Law, and they were deeply hostile to liberal political economy because they thought that the free market and free trade would lead to enormous social divisions and tear apart the organic bonds that kept classes in a delicately balanced sense of mutual reciprocal interests. So it's an important point that the reaction isn't simply just people trying to defend the interests of landed interest and agriculture. Now, the point about free trade that you've got to grasp is it's never really a coherent economic policy. Okay? My whole point that I'm trying to suggest to you is it's more of a gospel than a science or indeed a policy. There's 700 commodities subject to custom duties in 1840, 700 commodities having custom duties in 1840. By 1860, there's still 400. So even, 15 years after the, symbolic repeal of the Corn Laws, there's still 400 duties there. There's then a pact, a treaty between Britain and France with Richard Cobden and a Chevalier in 1860, and they reduce the final number of duties down to 1848. But from the 1870s, most other national economies are beginning to introduce protective measures. Okay, so the United States, Germany, France, Britain's main competing economies from the 1870s start introducing protective measures. It's only Britain that continues to hold out for free trade, even though everybody else is introducing protection. And indeed, Britain continues to have a de facto policy of free trade right down to 1931. Okay, so long after this economic policy, if policy it is, long after it becomes in Britain's economic self-interest to pursue free trade, they've been doing it for an additional 60 years. Okay? And that speaks to how important it is as a sort of moral and political vision of the world and of Britain's place in it. One other point that I want to make here. As I said to you on Thursday, one of the key tensions in liberalism is around the question of empire. Okay, so figures like Cobden and Bright, okay, fierce advocates of free trade, were profoundly opposed to the idea of empire. Their idea was that free trade would spread peace and prosperity around the world, and that Britain wouldn't need formal colonial control of territories in order to advance the case of civilization. Okay, because free trade would naturally do that work. Now, there are many others who believe that wasn't the case, and that you actually have to have formal colonial possession. Okay, and that happens increasingly from the 1850s onwards. That's not the point that I want to make. The point that I want to make that in certain conditions, Britain is prepared to impose free trade, to forcibly impose free trade upon both its colonial territories or indeed other nations. And the two best examples of this are the Opium Wars with China in the late 30s and 1840s, where Britain basically holds China to ransom with gunboats off the coast in order to open China up to the sale of opium from India, which led, of course, to the treaty ports in Shanghai and Hong Kong. the treaties that come out of those wars. And the other example is India, where Britain basically imposes the idea of free trade upon India in a grossly disadvantageous way for India. Okay, where basically they have to continue to buy British goods and to sell their goods at deflated prices to Britain. It's actually a more complicated story, but I'm going to come back to that on Thursday. So that is the set of ideas that are going to inform how it is that these two great events play out. Are there any questions that any of you have about that set of ideas about free trade and liberal political economy? Okay. Word of warning that the next time I stop, I'm going to insist that someone ask me a question. But I'm happy to go on, as I know how much you love listening to me. So let's move to the grisly, grisly story of the famine in Ireland. And I'm going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about the problem of the Irish, that is how the Irish were seen to be a problem in need of a solution by the British. I'm going to talk about famine as an example of a Malthusian natural check. And I'm going to talk to you about how the famine and the treatment of the famine illustrated the imposition of a liberal political economy upon Ireland and the responses that generated. So the Irish as a problem. Now, as I told you last week, Ireland had formally become part of the United Kingdom, of the new United Kingdom, in 1801, with the Act of Union of 1801. But that basically erases 2 centuries of colonisation and settlement by Anglo-Protestants in Ireland. Ireland then has a very long and complicated colonial relationship with Britain. And that makes it a very peculiar type of metropolitan colony. Okay? You can basically swim from Britain to Ireland. It's that close. Okay? And that creates its own very special sets of difficulties as using Ireland as a colonial territory. Effectively, the British considered Ireland to be the Irish to be a backward and primitive people. And they explained that backwardness in basically 3 types of ways. First of all, in confessional terms, which is to say, it's simple. The British were Anglicans, were Protestants, and the Irish had not seen the error of their ways as Catholics. Okay? So there's a simple religious divide here. They also saw them, secondly, as backward in a sort of civilization